Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending today's webinar, Colleges Held for Ransom, Responding to a Ransomware Attack. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a longer answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email, or feel free to reach out to Jim or I later. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget, and we encourage you to download that or any other resources or links that you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the help widget there at the bottom of your screen, and you can easily kind of manipulate the different boxes to make the screen work best for you during the presentation. This webinar is CLE accredited in Missouri for 1.2 hours of general CLE credit and 1 hour of general CLE credit in California and Illinois. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes, so from time to time you will be required to click a pop-up screen to reflect your continued engagement. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the course, and I'm going to mention this again at the very end, but there will be a very brief survey to complete at the end, and we really value and use that feedback to bring useful information to our audience or whoever ends up signing up and joining us. So please do fill that out and help us provide better content. And with that, I will do a brief, I just wanted to introduce our higher ed webinar series for those of you who are new to the series or just joining us. We do usually a monthly webinar of some sort through our higher ed practice here at Thompson Coburn, and that higher ed practice is led by Mr. Aaron Lacey, who you see there on the screen. And you can see our practice, we represent for-profit, nonprofit institutions across the country and even now around the globe. And we do a very wide variety of regulatory and corporate work, and we work with lots of different people across Thompson Coburn as a whole who have very specific niche practices that fit in right in with the myriad of topics that higher ed institutions face. So we cover a lot of different stuff, and our prior webinars you can actually access also on our website at thompsoncoburn.com. So feel free to look through those if there's anything useful to you, and we hope you might join us for a webinar in the future. I'm going to let Jim introduce himself, and then I'll do the same.
No, thanks, Katie. I'm Jim Shreve. I'm based in the Chicago and DC offices at Thompson Coburn, and I'm a partner here and chair of the cybersecurity practice at Thompson Coburn. I come from a financial services background, which, as Katie will explain in a few minutes, why that's important for the higher ed space. I oftentimes say my practice, the learning of it involves about 80% learning about technology and about 20% learning about law, because the technology changes constantly and the law doesn't change much at all. And that's certainly true in the ransomware space. And so we can't make ransomware fun, but we can make, but it certainly is interesting. But I think we can help prepare you better for if an incident unfortunately does happen, you'll be better prepared for it. Thanks, Katie.
Sure, and on that note of fun, maybe some of the other webinars in our higher ed series will be more lighthearted, but we will try to make it interesting here. Yeah, so I focus my practice, as I mentioned, our higher ed practice, we do regulatory and corporate work for schools, and so that is where the majority of my work happens, and I just have clients all across the gamut, and I really enjoy working on them to solve federal issues, accreditation issues, state and other regulatory issues, and I especially like helping them deal with stuff before they become a problem. So that's a little bit about our work, and a very quick rundown. You guys, I'm sure, can read the screen as well as us, but we are going to touch on some legal and regulatory issues for higher ed and how, this really applies to schools. and maybe kind of what it means to you. We will touch on what is ransomware, and then the importance of both doing backups and regular patching. We'll discuss how ransomware attacks are like and unlike breaches, data security breaches. We'll talk about Bitcoin, which is still a mystery to me, and we will also talk about the idea that it can happen to anyone and why schools are kind of especially vulnerable. And then we also have some additional resources that you can follow up on if you'd like some more information. So we'll start with a kind of, like I said, just kind of an overview of these issues. So GLBA it stands for the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which is a U.S. federal law that requires financial institutions to explain how they share and protect their customers' private information. So how does this apply? How does this become applicable to higher ed institutions? Well, any school receiving Title IV student aid funds has entered into an agreement with the Department of Education via their PPA, Program Participation Agreement, and as well as their Student and Internet Gateway Agreement. Both include stipulations about safeguarding data. And we are going to get into the nitty-gritty of all these requirements with Jim momentarily, but it just kind of makes sense to understand how schools really fit in here. So as an initial matter, post-secondary institutions are considered financial institutions per the GLBA. So the PPA and SAIG agreement require that schools have GLBA safeguards in place. If a school doesn't follow GLBA, it may be found administratively incapable, which could result in a myriad of consequences, including loss of Title IV eligibility. So it is a kind of a serious thing and something that a lot of schools, it's just, not on their radar with hundreds of other things that they need to deal with and kind of higher priority regulatory issues. A lot of times schools are not prioritizing these cybersecurity protections. So we want to kind of talk a little bit about that. And one thing to note is that you do have to submit evidence of compliance with GLBA for your institution's annual student aid compliance audit. So very briefly, we could talk for a whole hour about what the GLBA requires for higher ed institutions, but the department has issued some guidance, and so it gets into what all is required for schools under the GLBA. Schools have to develop, implement, and maintain a document data security program. They have to designate an employee to be in charge of this and coordinate that program, and they also have to train all employees. They have to identify reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks to data security. They need to control those risks by designing and implementing information safeguards and regularly test those. They need to, this is kind of a key one that I think gets forgotten by a lot of schools, you need to oversee your service providers. So anybody else who has access to your systems and your students' data, they also need to be aware of these requirements, and they need to sign something with the school saying that they will follow them. And finally, you need to evaluate and adjust your school's data security program if you find any holes or you find any problems. So that is how the GLBA is kind of gets over the schools. And I think Jim now is going to talk a little bit about UDAP and some breach notice requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. One thing I'd just briefly point out here, I think is important to note, is that the financial institutions requirements under the GLBA and the safeguards rule, there's various versions of the safeguards rule. There's one issued by the banking agencies, there's one issued by the SEC, but the catch-all one, and the one that's most pertinent to higher ed institutions, is the one issued by the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. And earlier this year, they proposed a significant revision to the safeguards rule. And the comment period is closed on that. And so sometime either later this year or early next year, we'll get a revised version of the FTC safeguards rule. And what I think is important to note about that is it reflects a trend in regulation in cybersecurity towards more specific enumerated security controls to be in place. The original safeguards rule was fairly loose. It left a lot of discretion to the financial institution as to how to best secure the data. The revised safeguards rule requires a lot of specific controls, such as around encryption, such as around penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, all sorts of things. So I think financial institutions and higher ed institutions who are subject to the safeguards rule, take a look at this revised rule and review it and go over it with your information security people, because that's what's coming. So next thing, UDAP, unfair and deceptive acts and practices. There's Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is the primary way the FTC goes after entities for various violations of other laws, including GLBA and the Safeguards Rule. And then there's also a version under most state laws. And deceptive is fairly easy. You said you'd do X and you did Y. You didn't do what you said you'd do. And so that's one way you can get in trouble in cybersecurity, is claim that you have certain controls in place that you actually don't have them in place. Unfairness is a little harder to prove. And so somebody's got to show, okay, what you were doing was unreasonable in light of the risks that you had in cybersecurity, so therefore you should have had certain controls in place. That's more malleable. There have been fewer actions under unfairness, but there certainly have been some. And that's applicable to any entity, regardless of whether you are a financial institution, higher ed institution, or other entity. Breach notice requirements. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but it suffices to say all states now have breach notice laws. A security breach is a little bit different than ransomware, and it can be ransomware attacks can be a little bit difficult to deal with under the breach notice laws. But there are two in particular I want to call out when we get to them. Connecticut and New Jersey that have unique formulations that can come into play with ransomware. Interagency guidance, I mean, you just know that that's a federal requirement that applies to banks, and so some of those requirements could be pushed onto you by contract. HIPAA is healthcare data. It's possible that some higher ed institutions could be covered entities or business associates under HIPAA and then subject to those requirements. And then there are other sectoral requirements for breach notice as well that could come into play. All right, so with that, we'll move on. So what is ransomware? I mean, at its core, it's a means of extortion. It's a way for cyber criminals to make money, and it's a very effective one. It's a source of income for your run-of-the-mill hackers, for organized crime, terrorist groups. Even North Korea uses ransomware to make hard currency. It's a type of malware, but not all malware is ransomware. Some malware doesn't ask for ransom. It only appears to be ransomware. But its core ransomware is a subset of malware. I think there are a few incidents that happened a couple of years ago. WannaCry, not PetChip. I mean, you may have heard about these in the news. These were high-profile ransomware incidents, but there are a lot of other variations, and they're constantly evolving out there. I would note that you might think, oh, we're small, we're not, we don't have a big footprint out there on the web. We don't have to worry about this. And the truth is that I'm seeing now versus years ago, attacks are increasingly going towards smaller entities because they're less prepared. And because the ransoms are low, quite often, any entity could pay the ransom. And so it might be easier to go after somebody small than go after a big, well-protected enterprise. I think one interesting variant to note here on ransomware is ransomware, there are endless possibilities. But quite often what you'll see with ransomware is the idea, okay, somebody gets onto your system, they find sensitive data on your system, they encrypt it, and then they tell you, unless you pay us a a certain amount of ransom, usually in a cryptocurrency, we will not decrypt this data so you don't have access to it. But what I've sometimes seen is instead of paying, say, so much Bitcoin, you provide a specified number of your contacts. So sort of like a pyramid scheme of ransomware, where then somebody can go and attack all of your best friends, which will make you very popular. And so while it may be enticing to think about using this for that ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse or the guy that cut you off in the parking lot this morning, it's probably not a good thing to do. There can be a bit of a flavor of the month when it comes to ransomware. Certain industries tend to get attacked en masse. And so I think if you've been following in the news, municipal governments and school systems are being bombarded right now on ransomware. And so don't think that makes you immune from it, because there are certainly plenty of attacks going on in higher education right now. And if higher education becomes that flavor of the month, we can expect to see a huge number of attacks. What else can we say about ransomware? Well, sometimes the attacks can be fake. You can have ransomware that's used as a ruse to do something else to someone. So it's the equivalent of somebody robbing a store by saying they have a gun in their pocket when it's really just their finger, or they can ask for ransom in order to divert your resources to come on and do something else to you. So it's not always actual ransomware. For the criminals, it's ultimately just a means to an end. It's a way for them to get paid and paid quickly. So, ransomware has been around since about 1989, but it's really taken off lately, largely because of cryptocurrencies making it a lot easier to get paid. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but whereas I did my first presentation on ransomware in 2009, and it was at that time pretty rare, even though I've been around for 20 years at that point. But in the last few years, cryptocurrencies have made it so much easier to get paid, and criminals, being rational maximizers, are utilizing that fact. So let's compare ransomware to a few other things. So I talked a little bit about malware. I mean, it's a broader kind of thing. Malware is software that's designed to do something destructive on your system, typically. So think about, if you remember the Sony attack, which most people believe perpetuated by North Korea in response to a film that Sony was releasing. That had multiple fronts, but a lot of them involved malware. Something getting onto the Sony systems to destroy information, destroy systems, and wreak havoc. Years ago, Saudi Aramco, before they were being attacked with missiles, were being attacked with malware that destroyed a large number of their computers and crippled some of their refining capabilities. So malware can steal data like personal information, but it can also be used to scope out a company for subsequent ransomware attacks. Something gets onto your system, looks for where the sensitive data is, and then ransomware comes on and encrypts it. DDoS, you might hear about distributed denial of service attack. Basically, this is when someone tries to take down your website or your internet-connected system through a large number of connections hitting it at one time. The difference between DDoS and regular DOS is that there's a lot of computers, a whole bank of computers doing the same thing. And that's different than ransomware, although you could have DDoS angle to a ransomware attack. Phishing and social engineering, that's where someone is trying to obtain critical information from you by tricking it out of people. And so, again, a different kind of thing than ransomware. Security breaches. A security breach is typically the unauthorized acquisition or access of personal information, which is a little bit like ransomware, but not the same thing. And so you can have multiple attack vectors in a given incident, and these illustrate just a few of the different attack vectors that could be used. Ransomware demands. So somebody gets onto your system, they say they've encrypted your data, and one of the surprising aspects to ransomware is that the ransomware demands are often quite low. It's a shotgun approach. Is typically cyber criminals want to infect a lot of machines, encrypt a lot of data on systems, and just see who pays them. And so one of the ways to get paid is to make the amount that you have to pay low. And so an enterprise may decide, okay, if the ransom amount is only, say, $500, well, yeah, we'd rather not pay the ransom, but if we have to restore from backups, we're going to lose a certain amount of data. It's going to take some time and a lot of effort. Maybe it's worth $500 to not miss an hour's worth of data, and so we'll pay the ransom. And that's typically how ransomware has gone. I would note that now we are seeing ransom amounts creep up in general, and so it's increasingly common to have ransom amounts that are in the thousands of dollars. And then also we're seeing attacks that are more targeted. Criminals now may know what you're equipped to pay. And so if they know you can pay a lot of money and they have access to a lot of sensitive information on you, they may decide, okay, we're going to make this ransom amount much higher. And so we're increasingly seeing ransom demands that are $500,000 or more, which changes the calculus quite a bit. It becomes, one, a lot more difficult to pay the ransom, and two, I think something you've got to really consider whether or not you're going to do it. And so with that in mind, so what do you do about ransomware? I think that, once an attack happens, in a lot of ways, there's a limited amount you can do about it. 90% of addressing ransomware, you really do in advance. Preparation is crucially important, and I think some of the most effective things you can do to help deal with ransomware is one, doing backups on your system. I mean, if you were to create a top 5 list or top 10 list of things you can do, probably 1 through 5 should be having good backups. And then in addition to that, knowing where your data is stored. And then I would also note you want to make sure that you're keeping your software up to date and patched, because a lot of ransomware exploits things that are out of date on the system. Using anomaly detection is important, and because ransomware is a constantly evolving thing, so signature-based controls may not be sufficient. But let's go into a little more depth on what some of these are. And so if you do constant backups and your backups are not themselves vulnerable to being encrypted in a ransomware attack, you are far less likely to need to pay ransom because the amount of the data you might lose in the attack if you don't pay the ransom is likely to be much less, and it'll be easier for you to restore from those backups. The data mapping, which is an exercise I recommend for just about everybody, is somebody coming in, usually an outside vendor, to look at your systems and tell, okay, what data do we have, where does it reside, and how does it flow through the system? Doing that will not only help with lowering your vulnerability to ransomware, but it'll help you know how bad an incident is when a ransomware attack happens. You'll know, okay, this system was involved. You'll know ahead of time what data was on that system, and so what the effect is to you. as I mentioned before, you've got to design your backups so that somebody can't get on your system and encrypt the primary source of the data, and then also encrypt the backup as well, because then your backups were useless in it. So I think that's also important. I think talk to your IT people about how often you're backing up, how you're doing it, and maybe increase the frequency with which you're doing the backups, and do backups on more of your data, because that'll greatly improve your resilience to ransomware attacks. Regular patching of software. I mean, there have been multiple releases of vulnerabilities that come out, and they happen all the time. The Snowden incident a few years back showed many previously unknown vulnerabilities in software, often called zero-day exploits. And because anything that makes something vulnerable can be used to distribute ransomware. They're always looking for new ways to get the software out of there. I think a thing to remember too is that when you're using really old software, at some point it's no longer going to be patched, and so there are risks to continuing to use that software for a long time. One thing that was particularly vulnerable and has been treated as end of life by Microsoft is Windows XP. Microsoft has released, I think, maybe a couple of emergency patches for Windows XP, but basically, they're as a standard course, they're not patching it. So if you're using it, those are some vulnerabilities. So even if it's not that software, think about if you have other software that's being utilized that may have vulnerabilities. And one other thing I'd point out here before I pass it back off to Katie is ransomware attacks happen very quickly. And so, again, on the preparation side, is know who you would involve in an attack. And so you want to line up not only your internal resources, but your external resources that you may need to have, because if you've worked on a security breach, I mean, those happen fast. You may be responding, and it may be beginning to end within a few days. Ransomware can be even faster than that. I mean, typically it's not longer than a couple of days, and sometimes the window to pay can be within just a few hours. So you have to move really fast. So think about in advance who you'd have to help with forensics or other IT services, who you do on legal. I mean, and point out legal is important not only to advise on the legal issues, but also to help bring in a lot of those other vendors so that you can best protect what they find under privilege, as well as PR firms, because ransomware attacks can get out in the public, and you'll need to be thinking about what you're saying and who's saying it on behalf of your institution if it comes out. So with that, I'll pass it back to Katie to talk a little bit about training.
Yeah, so in addition to patches and the backups that Jim just discussed, another key kind of protection to put in place is really training and educating your employees. And I'll talk a little bit later about how schools are unique because they have such a broader audience and they have employees and students with access to some of these systems. But for employees specifically, it's all about educating them about the possibility of an attack and just kind of letting them know all the signs to look for. And I think one of the most important things to do is up front just make sure that they all know that they should think about it. And if they aren't sure, even if they think it's totally fine, but they think there's something a tiny bit off about it, they should just ask IT. Just send it to IT, flag it. It'll take 30 seconds, and then they can get an all clear, and it'll save the day in case anything is up. So, you know, you want to instruct them to be careful when opening attachments and when clicking on links. You can look for misspellings or suspicious titles of emails. The content just doesn't seem quite right. It doesn't seem like something this person has sent you before, or somebody with this title or from this company or from this outside agency would send you. Sometimes ransomware attacks can come from a known contact. They might have accessed your address book and found people who who they know you trust, and so you would not hesitate to open an email from them. They also could change one letter in their name, so you look at it quickly thinking it's Katie Wendel, but it's really Katie Wendell or whatever. And you can leverage existing phishing training to kind of go through this extra layer of security awareness and training, and also just from a higher level limit the ability of what people can run on their own machines. So might slow things down when they need to download a new program on their computer, but it'll protect the company from them downloading something malicious. And now Jim is going to talk a little bit more about how ransomware attacks are different than data breaches and where they overlap.
Oh, thanks, Katie. So I think a lot of people would think, okay, ransomware attack, data breach, that ransomware attacks maybe are a subset of breaches. And they're actually somewhat different. And it can be a little bit difficult to analyze ransomware under the breach notice laws. Usually under state breach notice laws, and we have breach notice laws in all 50 states now, plus DC, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, and many now even outside the U.S., although in the U.S. we're still the kings of breach notice. And so they're triggered usually by either unauthorized acquisition of personal information or unauthorized access of personal information. Some states include both. You have to have both acquisition and access. Some just have acquisition. And I think acquisition is in some ways the easier way to think about it because somebody didn't actually get the data. They came onto your system. They found the data there, probably in through a program, not even manually, and they encrypted it. It stayed on your system the whole time, never left your system in a typical ransomware attack. Not always, but usually. Did they ever actually have an unauthorized acquisition of the data? Probably not. Access is a little harder, but most states, the way the law is written and the way it's usually interpreted, the information has to be actually accessed. So in that situation, I think you can make a plausible argument that where somebody just in an automated way encrypted the data, they didn't really access the data. It just sat on your system and was encrypted. But where it's more difficult is in Connecticut and New Jersey. The statute is written a little bit differently and looks to whether or not you have access to the data. And the state AGs in those states have specifically taken the position that accessible personal information, that where you have a malicious person that can access the data, that's a security breach. And it's specifically because of ransomware. And so in some states, they be prepared that your ransomware incident may be a security breach. I would also note that if you have contracts with third parties, so it's quite often the data that you have on your system is not data that you own, and so it may belong to someone else. And so those contracts not only may set more stringent requirements for what constitutes a security breach, but also heightened requirements about what you have to do in a security breach. And they may require that someone, that other entity, be involved in the response. So even though security breaches aren't the same as ransomware, I do think they provide a good framework for the response, because a lot of the same people that you would involve in a security breach response, you would involve in a ransomware attack response. And so when you have an incident response plan, that's usually a good place to start with how to deal with a ransomware attack. Is you're going to typically utilize those same people to do it. You're going to want to keep the group small, but include everybody that you need, and then respond to it in what may be an expedited way versus a security breach. And so, as part of that response program, one of the issues that can come up is, should I contact law enforcement? If so, who should I contact? Typically, in ransomware, there's not a significant amount of risk, and there can be in some circumstances, but in contacting law enforcement, it's certainly something that should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. But I also would caution that there can be a limited amount that law enforcement can do to provide significant assistance. Quite often, ransomware is unique. And so just because they saw a variant of it before doesn't mean that they will necessarily be able to help you with what you have now. And there's the timing issue. Law enforcement may move quick, but you may have only hours to respond in a ransomware attack. So by the time you engage law enforcement, you may be up against the deadline to pay the ransom. And also, law enforcement is spread thin. And so particularly where the ransom amount is small, getting somebody like the FBI or Secret Service to take an interest in a given incident may be more difficult. If you're only out a few hundred or a few $1,000s, obviously that's different if you may be out several $100,000 or millions of dollars. But I would say definitely have a prior relationship with law enforcement before an incident happens. It's usually money well spent to have your counsel, information security folks take somebody from the FBI out to lunch from your local field office to talk to them, to know the kinds of things that they can help you with, and to give you some of the contacts that may be helpful in addressing a given situation. So we talked some about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrency is something that's intended as a currency that operates really more like a commodity, but utilizing blockchain and an algorithm that is an agreed exchange, and in the ransomware context, because it's fairly anonymous, not entirely anonymous, but fairly anonymous, makes it a lot easier for cyber criminals to get paid for doing things including ransomware. And so whereas years ago, if somebody wanted to get on your system and encrypt data and get paid, it was actually kind of difficult for them. It's not as though they can just give you their bank account number. And so sometimes what I would see was the cyber criminal would give you an address to send a bunch of prepaid cards to a PO box. And that's not a scalable business model for the criminals. And so, and you had to constantly keep moving, and a lot of difficulties. Cryptocurrencies, though, easily convertible into hard cash or into other cryptocurrencies, difficult to trace. The transactions themselves are very well tracked, but who engages in them is very difficult to determine. So cryptocurrencies have made it a lot easier for criminals to get paid, and so it's very popular with them. I would point out that law enforcement, not wanting to encourage ransomware or other criminal activity, strongly will recommend you against paying ransom. And they're looking at it in the aggregate. They want to discourage this kind of thing, but your interests may be different. It may be that you really need the data and you don't have a good backup, and so you need to be able to pay that ransom. but I would caution that if you are paying, or even sometimes if you're considering paying, that can adversely affect your relationship with the law enforcement. So I think I would just point that out and keep that in mind. And then even if you do pay, I mean, not all cyber criminals have good ethics. I know it's surprising, but sometimes you can pay ransom and they won't give you the decryption keys. That's the last you'll hear from them. Or it may be that they give you the encryption keys, but it doesn't decrypt all of your data. And even if they do give you the proper encryption keys and you're able to decrypt the data, you may have certain structured data, certain very well formatted data that may be essentially broken by the encryption process. And so the data you get back may not be entirely usable, or it may take a significant amount of work to get the data to be usable again after you paid the ransom. So I think that's all stuff to keep in mind. Cyber insurance has become a much bigger topic in this space. I mean, cybersecurity insurance has changed a lot since I started working in this area. When it really came into being about 10 years ago. At that time, it was very expensive and covered very little because the insurers really could not price what the risk was. And so as a consequence, fairly few companies got cybersecurity policies. In the last 3, 4, 5 years, the market has matured significantly. The policies now cover more and are more reasonably priced, although they're still often quite expensive. I would say there's still fairly little uniformity in terminology or in coverage. And so it can make it tough to shop for policy. If you're looking at them, it's tough to make an apples-to-apples comparison as to what these policies cover. Ransomware incidents often are covered under a cyber policy, but not necessarily always. Ransomware may also be covered under a kidnap, ransom, and extortion policy. For you, I'd say look closely at your policy to see if ransomware attacks are covered. And if they are, some things to consider is what types of expenses will it cover? Will it cover all those outside resources I talked about you may need in a ransomware attack? Will it cover your downtime that you're out of commission from a ransomware attack? Because while the ransom window may only be a few hours or a few days, it's also possible that you may be out of commission for several weeks, even several months, relative to that data while you're trying to reconstitute it and get your system going again. So think about that. Will it cover the ransom amount? I mean, as I said, typically that's small, but in some cases it's fairly significant. So consider if they'll pay that under the policy. And then lastly, consider if it'll cover lost business and reputation. If it that can be a huge and difficult to measure repercussion of a ransomware attack. So see if that's something that's going to be covered. If you do submit a claim for a ransomware attack, you may need to involve the insurer early in the process under the terms of the policy. And so as you're going through addressing the incident, it's then possible that you may lose some autonomy in the process. Some of the important decisions that you're facing may be made more or even exclusively by the insurer, not by you. So certainly a lot of things to think about. Katie, who could this happen to?
Well, and really quickly on that note on insurance, I will say I have spoken with some companies and guys that do insure higher ed institutions and put together their packages and policies, and they did say that they have done some underwriting on cybersecurity additions to those packages. So definitely something that some of these companies are doing and something just to ask about and look into. And yes, this it can happen to anyone, Jim. And we will show some examples in a couple slides of schools that have been hit just in this calendar year. But we've all heard of ransomware attacks in the news. As Jim mentioned earlier, they are happening in all kinds of different areas, and you're here, so you must recognize that fact. And higher ed is particularly vulnerable, as we touched on a little earlier, and then I'm going to talk about again in the next slide. But yeah, I mean, this is a profitable area. Criminals know they can quickly make money. Not a lot of work sometimes to get in and get a payoff. So, and things are always changing. Always the next hot new way for someone to sneak into your system or find a vulnerable individual to let them in. So, again, back to that idea that user education is one of the keys to protecting against these attacks. So, particular issues in higher education. We talked a little bit at the very beginning about how the regulations cover higher ed institutions and the fact that they need to be aware of these regulations and that they're obligated to follow them just by the basis of their Title IV through the Department of Education. And this is a hot topic because there is a high risk of an attack, and the field hasn't really caught up to this idea that it's happening. Schools hold tons of valuable information, and so hackers see them as vulnerable targets. And when you, as I mentioned at the very beginning, when a school has 1,000 things to deal with and address every day, this is going to keep moving to the bottom of the list until it happens to you or your neighbor's school, and then, of course, it becomes quickly a high priority. So, yeah, I mean, schools are focused on this idea of free exchange of ideas. They want to have access to their systems for their students and for the public. So they have tons of different, and alumni, they have lots of different constituents and lots of people who might have an interest in the school and have access to their systems. There are a lot of different endpoints. And so we've talked about training employees, but schools, of course, also have students to worry about. And a lot of schools now have online programs, so students specifically are just online, spend a lot of time online with their schools, even the in-person students. And so there is this idea of limiting who can have access to the that information that a breach might be worth making. So you can really kind of make that number very small, and that will also help protect what you've got at your school. We touched a little bit about the insurance, and then just this idea of the administration of cybersecurity and who, you know, as I mentioned at the very beginning, under GLBA, each school is obligated to have a specific plan in place for security and designate someone to be in charge of that plan and to make sure that it's happening. So, you know, it's important to figure out then where that individual sits in your tree of your school. You know, are they under IT? Are they directly reporting to the president? It just kind of depends on how you have things set up and what makes the most sense for you. But then again, comes back to this idea of where do those resources come from to help pay for that and help pay for the protection up front, and then I guess if anything went wrong, what you would do after that. So Jim talked about whether or not you should report to federal agencies when this happens. You are obligated under the SAIG agreement that you make with the Department of Education. You are obligated to report actual and suspected breaches of cybersecurity issues on the day it is detected or suspected. So a ransomware attack would certainly, in my opinion, be considered a breach that you would want to report. To report those, you can, if you go to one of the links on our final page that has more information from the Department of Ed on these issues, and there on one of those pages is the link for how you can report a breach, but you send an email to the specific email address at the Department of Ed, and include information like the date of the breach, the known or suspected date, the impact of the breach, and how it happened, and what's the remediation status and next steps. So something to keep in mind as we are talking about ransomware attacks. And so, as we mentioned earlier, there have been several incidents of ransomware attacks affecting colleges and universities just in 2019. Of course, there are many examples earlier than that, but just this year we saw a $2 million ransom attack on Monroe College in July. The attack took down the school's website, the learning management system, and email, and it just really wreaks havoc and causes a lot of distress on the part of your entire school community, and just not one of those things you really want to have to deal with, of course. But Regis University also had an attack just last month. Their school's email and phone went down, and it obviously disrupted their educational programs. And then in March of 2019, Grinnell, Oberlin, and Hamilton colleges, their admissions systems had a ransomware attack, and they sent ransom notices to students and people who had applied at those schools and weren't even students. Sent them a link saying you can pay us, I think it started around $3,000, and we will share with you the files that we got from the school, your admissions file. And then eventually the attacker went down to a $60 request from students to get access to that file. But, it just goes to show that this affects all types of schools. It affects nonprofit schools and for-profit schools and small and large. So it could happen to any of the schools that we help serve. As I mentioned, we have these available resources. These are just some articles or some pages that can give you a lot more information and maybe answer some of your questions, of which, of course, we are going to answer a couple, I believe, now. So let me see. There's our contact information. Feel free to email me or Jim with any questions. Happy to chat with you about specific things that you'd like to talk about. And now we have a couple of questions here. The first one, how do you determine if a ransomware attack is a HIPAA violation, and what should you do? Jim, I will toss that over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think first thing to think about, HIPAA imposes, it has sort of three components. So HIPAA has privacy requirements, it has security requirements, and it has breach notice requirements. And in terms of breach notice, it's a lot of what I talked about before, just like under the state breach notice laws. It's figuring out if the way a ransomware attack happened, the data that's involved, is it, well, first of all, are you subject to HIPAA? And then if it is, does it involve, protected health information in a way that is a breach under HIPAA, in which case then you have to respond to it just as any other security breach. And then there's also the security issue, which you face under HIPAA safeguarding requirements, as well as you face under the GLBA safeguards rule, which is that where the ransomware attack itself may not be a violation, but it could expose a violation. There are certain state AGs in dealing with security breaches that don't really go after the breach itself as a violation, but they looked at, did the breach expose the fact that you didn't have required security controls in place? And whether those are specific controls or kind of more general unreasonableness in your controls. And so a ransomware incident certainly can expose gaps in your security. And there's a question of, do those gaps constitute a violation of HIPAA or the safeguards rule, or even state requirements, like Massachusetts has requirements under the breach notice law on data security. So I think that's really what how to deal with that under HIPAA or under those kind of general security type requirements.
And I will add on to that. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to add on to what you said with some good news for any schools that are on the phone. The Office of Civil Rights, which is the government agency that enforces HIPAA, has clarified that HIPAA generally does not apply to institutions of higher education. So as Jim did clarify, first you have to decide if you're even, covered by HIPAA, if you're a covered entity. If not, then you don't need to worry about it necessarily. But the law does apply to covered entities, which include health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and healthcare providers that transmit health information in electronic form in connection with covered transactions. And then covered transactions are those for which the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has adopted a standard, such as healthcare claims submitted to a health plan. So although many schools employ nurses and healthcare providers, they generally do not engage in covered transactions, such as billing health plans electronically for those services. Further, the student health information maintained by schools is part of their education record or treatment record, and HIPAA specifically excludes student health information that is already covered by FERPA. So one wrinkle to that is then if you do have non-student patients at a school medical facility, any individually identifiable health information of those non-student patients is subject to HIPAA. So, good question. And then Jim, I don't know if you had anything else to add into that particular issue, or if you want to move on to another one.
No, I think we can move on.
Okay. So this one says, is NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, collecting and tracking ransomware incidents? That's a good question. Jim, do you have any idea off the top of your head on that one?
I don't off the top of my head. I mean, I know that. I mean, there's a lot of tracking of security breaches, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of those tracking resources. I mean, and a lot of it goes back to the fact about half of the state breach notice laws require notice to a state agency, most often the state attorneys general, and so those AG offices will often post notices that they receive online. And so you'll get either government groups or even sort of consumer advocacy groups or other privacy groups that will mine those online letters to create somewhat of a database. And some of those entities will break down incidents by their nature. And so it's possible that somebody's doing that, having ransomware be one of the subgroups of breach notices generally. But I don't know that particularly NCSL or anyone else is doing that right now.
Okay. And then, let's see, we have another question. Any idea about the resolution or result of any of these major college attacks? I don't know. I mean, I can tell you that a lot of ransomware happens and you never hear about it. Certainly if you're at the entity that has it, you'd rather it not come out into the public. But even among those that do become public, it's usually been quite tight-lipped about whether or not they paid the ransom or not. One of the reasons for that being, and I would point out, sometimes I call this a blood in the water effect, is that cyber criminals will monetize anything, including the fact that you were vulnerable, and so they may sell the names of entities that they've attacked. They may sell how they attacked them, and they may sell whether or not they paid. And so one of the things you may find if you pay ransom is you may get hit again several times more in largely similar ways. So, but as for these particular incidents, I haven't heard how they've been resolved. I don't know offhand, what if there's been regulatory actions out of those.
but I haven't seen too much in the way of technical resolution.
Yeah, same for me. We have another question here. How about HR records, healthcare records for employees that you may have at that college, if that would also be, I guess, subject to HIPAA? So the reason that the student records I mentioned earlier are not covered by HIPAA is basically because they are already covered by FERPA, and FERPA applies to only currently enrolled students. So applicants, alumni, donors, employees, they don't have FERPA rights, and their records are not considered education records or treatment records. So great question, and HR healthcare records for employees would be considered, or could potentially be covered by HIPAA.
Yeah, and for breach notice requirements, whereas the nature of the relationship with the entity, the individual to whom the data relates to the entity, matters for a lot of the sectoral requirements, such as the Gramm-Leach-Bliley requirements. Are they a customer or not? Or the HIPAA requirements, are you a covered entity or business associate? The breach notice laws just look to if an individual is a state resident. And so employees are going to be covered by those. And so you have to analyze whether or not it is a breach. And then under some of those breach laws, there are also data security requirements, like in Massachusetts and in California and some other places, that apply across the board to any state resident.
Okay, and I think that about does it. We have run out of time, so I think we have a couple more little questions, and I am happy to send emails to those individuals after we are done with the webinar. So thank you so much for participating in our webinar and joining us. Please complete that survey I mentioned at the beginning. You can find it down at the bottom, I believe, or we'll send it to you via email, I think, once the, oh yeah, I'm sorry. It says, please complete and submit the survey located in the widget at the bottom of your screen. So there you go. We appreciate your time and hope to have you join us again for another webinar in our series in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.